is God versus science. Some in academia today claim that science has killed God. They don't mean this in a literal sense, but what they hope to communicate is that science has removed the need for God, or stronger, that science has demonstrated the non-existence of God. Statements like these lead many to think that these two concepts, God and science, are mutually exclusive. Tonight, I address the question, can God and science both be true? Well, before answering this question, clarification is needed. Specifically defining both science and God is required. Now, science is commonly understood to be the study of nature. It follows then that a scientist is one who studies nature. This means scientists have a specific expertise in understanding nature based on observable and empirical data via the scientific method. This is the field of a scientist. This is what a scientist does. A chemist, for example, like Frank. A chemist can share insights about chemistry, but they begin departing their field when they make statements about other areas of science, such as biology or physics. A scientist is completely out of their field of expertise when they comment on other things, such as literary criticism, art appreciation, politics, or anything other than nature. Now, God, if he exists, is the creator of all nature. It logically follows then that God would be something other than nature, unless one wants to affirm incoherent statements like, nature existed before nature existed. Thus, one who studies nature, a scientist, is simply in the wrong field if they claim their credentials give them any special authority to speak about the existence or non-existence of anything other than nature. You might as well ask a plumber what they think. Nothing against plumbers. But you see, a plumber and a scientist don't have any special authority or expertise when it comes to things other than nature. Be that as it may, there are many logic-based arguments demonstrating God's existence. Over the course of this next year, here at Reasonable Faith, we are going to examine many of these arguments. One of my favorites is called the Kalam cosmological argument. Now, the Kalam is based on the laws of logic. But the laws of logic, you see, are presupposed by science. A scientist can't even begin conducting or engaging in the scientific method without first presupposing that the laws of logic and the rules of reason are true. So the Kalam is based on the laws of logic, but moreover, it's also supported by scientific data, leading to the conclusion that at least one thing exists that is other than nature. That is to say, there is at least one thing which is supernatural, namely, in this case, God. We will discuss this argument later. Moreover, my master's thesis, the argument known as the free-thinking argument against naturalism, which was the focus of my master's thesis, logically proves that other supernatural things exist. These immaterial things, or supernatural things, things other than nature exist. In this case, it's the human soul that I deductively argue for. So these are two great reasons to conclude that the philosophy of naturalism is false. By the way, naturalism is nothing but a philosophy, and a bad one at that. I want to discuss the faith of a naturalist. Many have a faith, a blind faith, in naturalism, starting with the presupposition that all that exists is nature. One who affirms naturalism affirms that all that exists is nature and nothing else. Only things which can be scientifically tested or discoverable. It is only these things that exist, if you're a naturalist. If this assumption happens to be correct, then that only nature exists, then it would follow that only things that can be scientifically tested and empirically verified, only those types of things exist, nothing else. So right off the bat, it's vital to recognize that this philosophy of naturalism is only a question-begging assumption that can never be proven. So, why think it's any good? Why think it's a good assumption, let alone correct? Why think it's true? This belief that nature is all that exists is simply a belief held via faith alone, a blind faith at that. There are many reasons to think this philosophy of naturalism is incorrect. The assumption that all that exists is nature leads to the notion that the study of nature, what we call science, would be the only way of knowing reality. This view is referred to as scientism, right? Scientism. This view of scientism can also be called empiricism or verificationism. These terms are often used interchangeably. Basically, one who affirms scientism holds that science alone is the source of all knowledge and truth. In fact, a scientist once told me that science is the only way of knowing. Well, this raises the question, how does he know that? Did a scientific experiment or an empirical observation provide this supposed knowledge? Of course not. The view of scientism is self-referentially defeating. The empiricist claims to possess knowledge, that science is the only way to gain knowledge. However, this knowledge claim itself is itself something that cannot be gained via the scientific method. It's important to think logically. If one believes that only the things which can be scientifically verified provide truth, and they believe that's true, then they have a big problem. Why? Because the statement itself cannot be scientifically validated. Think about it. The statement, only scientific discoveries are true, is not a statement that is scientifically testable or discoverable. It's not discovered in a lab. This is known as a self-defeating statement. It's a logical fallacy. I always like to say, any argument based on a logical fallacy is no argument at all. To clarify, this is similar to the following statement. There are no sentences that contain more than 3 words. How many words is that? It's not a trick question. It's 10. There are no sentences that contain more than 3 words. Should we believe that sentence? Should we believe that proposition? Of course not. The sentence is comprised of 10 words. Therefore, that statement is false. Self-defeating statements cannot be true and ought not be believed, at least by individuals who consider themselves to be empowered by reason. It's vital to realize that empiricism is nothing but a philosophy of epistemology. Big, scary word. Just a second here. The philosophy of epistemology. Big, scary word. Now, the philosophy of epistemology, I'm going to explain this here, but this view of empiricism is not based on the laws of logic, but only on question-begging assumptions, which is another logical fallacy. Typically, if one holds to the assumption of scientism, it's because this assumption is based upon another assumption, that of naturalism. Now, let's talk about naturalism again. Naturalism is a view based on the assumption, blind faith assumption. Okay? This is a blind faith. The naturalist, I hope you see here, holds to a blind faith. Naturalism is a view based on the assumption, the blind faith assumption, that nature is all that exists. Now, I should make it clear that naturalism can also mean different things to different people. Most who affirm naturalism will contend that only nature exists. That's their faith. Only nature exists. This is specifically defined, here's another big scary word, as metaphysical naturalism. Others might be open to the supernatural, but claim that no one could ever know if things other than nature exist or not. Those in this camp are called epistemological naturalists. Now, here's the difference between epistemology and metaphysics. Epistemology just means how we come to know things. It's the study of knowledge and how we possess knowledge. That's all epistemology means. Metaphysics is the study of ultimate reality, or ontology. So a lot of times we'll have to distinguish between ontology and epistemology. Okay? So again, epistemology is just a study of how we know, and metaphysics or ontology is the study of ultimate reality. Two different things. Now, William Lane Craig has pointed out that one can be an epistemological naturalist and still reject metaphysical naturalism. So that is to say that one could think that the only way to gain knowledge is through science and empirical observation, but that perhaps God and angels and souls do exist. They just don't think we could ever know that. There are good reasons to reject metaphysical naturalism, that nature is all that exists, and this is the focus of the rest of my talk tonight. Unless stated otherwise, I will refer to metaphysical naturalism simply as naturalism. Now, as I've already pointed out, scientism is logically self-refuting, and therefore it's false, as it offers a knowledge claim that is assumed apart from scientific discovery. Sometimes the advocates of this view will exclaim, well, you gotta start somewhere. I respond to that statement by saying that one should start with the laws of logic as opposed to science, because science presupposes and is based on the laws of logic. One self-proclaimed empiricist once accused me of circular reasoning. However, the fallacy of circular reasoning, also known as begging the question, is a logical fallacy not based on science. So this skeptic was essentially appealing to logic in an attempt to defeat logic. Therefore, he inadvertently affirmed logic. You see, logic is bedrock, and I hope you take that away from this discussion tonight. Logic is bedrock. You can't get beneath it. If one wants to start with science instead of logic, then they need to provide scientific reasons that do not assume logic to explain why one should not start with the laws of logic. Why? Well, consider the fact that everything I can think of, mathematics, science, the historical method, and even theology itself, are all based on and assume the laws of logic. Logic is bedrock. Think about this. If NASA thought little green men on Mars existed, well, they would be justified in conducting missions to see if they could empirically verify the existence of these green Martians. However, if NASA stated that married bachelors were living in Montana, drawing triangles with four corners, and jumping out of infinitely tall bottomless pits, well, one would not need to exert any effort at all to travel across the state line to empirically verify if this is true or not. Why? Because it's logically impossible for bachelors to be married. It is logically impossible for triangles to have four corners. And it's logically impossible for anyone, even a super Martian with infinite jumping abilities, to jump out of an infinitely tall bottomless pit. You see, science is not necessary to attain this knowledge, although logic is. So unless the empiricist can provide a means of reasoning that does not require the presupposition of logic, then logic, as opposed to science, is the correct starting point. Logic is the ground level and foundation of reaching reasonable and true conclusions. The professor of logic at Oxford University, Dr. Timothy Williamson, asks the question, and I quote, "Why can't there be things only discoverable by non-scientific means, or not discoverable at all?" End quote. This is a valid question that the naturalist must answer. Moreover, imagine if we had only developed 4 senses instead of 5. Suppose humanity never evolved the sense of smell. Would that imply that there were no odors or scents? Does that imply that there would be no smellable things? This raises the question, why can't there be things that would be detectable if we would have developed a 6th sense, or perhaps a 7th sense? To simply respond just because is not a good answer. It's not an academic response. You see, just as creatures without noses should still be open to the idea of the existence of smellable things, the epistemological naturalist should still be very open to the idea of the supernatural. Epistemological naturalism, as I've explained, is self-defeating and therefore false. However, even if someone is committed to that incoherent position, they have no basis for rejecting the existence of things that are not detectable by our 5 senses. This includes God. Dr. Williamson reiterates the point I've already made. He says, and I quote, "It is not discoverable by hard science that all truths are discoverable by hard science." End quote. You see, scientism fails its own test, and therefore it cannot be true. People who hold this illogical position lose all grounds for rejecting Christianity on an intellectual basis. Now, with all of that said, even though there are good reasons to believe that epistemological naturalism is false, namely it's self-defeating, it does not logically imply, even if it were true, that metaphysical naturalism must be true. It follows that one can be an epistemic naturalist and still be open to postulating immaterial aspects of reality, even if doing so, if doing so is an inference to the best explanation of our experiences. Therefore, an epistemic naturalist should believe in God, I believe. Or I believe they should believe in God after contemplating logical arguments, many of which we will examine this year. Arguments such as the Kalam cosmological argument, the Leibnizian argument from contingency, the fine-tuning argument, the moral argument, the ontological argument, and the free-thinking argument against naturalism, just to name a few. The inference to the best explanation is what we're after here. And the inference to the best explanation is a reasonable faith, as opposed to a blind faith. You see, naturalists hold to a blind faith that nature is all that exists. However, Christians can hold to a reasonable faith, which is supported by much scientific data as well. Dr. Williamson from Oxford University concludes, and I quote, "Epistemological naturalism is not incompatible with religion." End quote. Therefore, there's no good reason for an epistemological naturalist to reject Christian theism. The cumulative case of evidence demonstrates that there is much more to reality than simply matter, nature, and physical things. These arguments are based on logic, and many of them, as I said, are supported by scientific data. Now, science is the study of nature, and therefore is impotent to disprove or prove or even talk about things other than nature, what we call supernatural. With that said, however, I want you to think about this. Scientific data can strengthen premises and philosophical arguments leading to logical conclusions with supernatural significance or theistic implications. That's a mouthful. Let me say it again. Science cannot directly prove or disprove the existence of God, souls, angels, demons, or anything immaterial or other than nature. However, science still is useful. Scientific data can strengthen premises and philosophical arguments leading to logical conclusions with supernatural significance or theistic implications. Psalm 19:1 says, "Day after day, your creation pours forth speech. Night after night, it delivers knowledge." Accordingly, you see, when one studies God's creation, studies nature, they can gain knowledge. You see, some theologians study God's word, others study his work. That's the job of a scientist. You see, scientists are actually theologians, whether they realize it or not. Scientists study the work of God. Science and God are not in conflict, even though science and some religious claims might be. That's the topic of our next discussion in 2 weeks. Come back for that one. Thank you.